A ragged little girl, barely 7 years old, was caught trying to steal a loaf of bread in the kitchen of a multi-million-dollar mansion. Malnourished, with eyes sunken from hunger, she was captured and locked in an old iron cage by the owner of the house, a man known for his ruthlessness. But no one expected that this child held a secret capable of forever transforming the coldest heart in the world. What happened when he discovered the truth about who she really was would change not only their lives, but touch the hearts of millions. Subscribe to the channel for stories that touch your heart every day. The mansion stood like a marble and glass fortress against the grey afternoon sky, its perfectly manicured lawns a stark contrast to the sprawling, chaotic city beyond the high walls. Within those walls, the silence was broken only by the echo of calculated footsteps on the gleaming floors. The millionaire walked through the hallways with the rigid posture of someone who had turned coldness into armor. At 43, his graying hair already betrayed the weight of a life built on foundations of bitterness. His eyes, once capable of smiling, were now 2 windows shuttered to a devastated interior. The impeccably tailored suit couldn't disguise the loneliness that emanated from his every gesture. That morning, like every other, he went through his meticulous routine, checking financial reports, analyzing investments, rejecting social invitations. His assistant had learned to filter out anything that might awaken in him any vestige of humanity. Charity, denied. Family events, cancelled. Relationships, non-existent. The desk in his office was piled high with multi-million-dollar contracts, but empty of photographs or personal mementos. There was only one object that broke the impersonality of the environment, a small locked drawer in the right-hand corner of the desk. No one knew what he kept there, nor dared to ask. On the other side of the city, separated by miles of asphalt and light years of reality, a 7-year-old girl awoke on pieces of wet cardboard. Her thin little body trembled not only from the morning chill, but from the hunger that had gnawed at her insides for days. Her bare feet, cut by the rough concrete, bled discreetly as she rose. Her large eyes, disproportionate to her small, angular face, seemed to hold the bitter wisdom of someone who had already seen the world show its cruelest side. Her tangled hair fell over her bony shoulders, and her clothes, rags that had once been a dress, hung loosely on her malnourished body. The girl no longer cried. She had learned that tears did not feed, did not warm, did not protect. They only showed weakness to a world that no longer had pity on her. Instead, she had developed an animal instinct for survival that made her seek food in the most unlikely places. That morning, her feet instinctively led her in the direction of the wealthy neighborhoods. Not by conscious choice, but because something within her whispered that there she might find the generous leftovers of those who had much. She didn't know that she was walking straight into the encounter that would change her life forever. The sun rose slowly over the city, illuminating 2 worlds that seemed to exist on different planets. On one side, the calculated coldness of a man who had chosen isolation as protection. On the other, the pure vulnerability of a child who had no choice but to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. Destiny, however, was already beginning to weave the invisible threads that would unite them irreversibly. It was almost noon when the girl approached the walls of the mansion. The hunger had become a physical pain that cut her stomach like sharp blades. For hours, she had watched the movements of the house through the ornate gates, studying the patterns of the security guards, the schedules of the maids, the windows that remained open. Her experience on the streets had taught her that big houses always had well-stocked kitchens, but also ruthless security systems. Even so, need spoke louder than fear. With the agility of someone who had learned to move like a shadow, she found a flaw in the system, a small opening in the back wall near the garden, where the stones had given way over time. The millionaire was in his office when the first silent alarm flashed on the security screen. His eyes, trained to detect any anomaly in his business dealings, immediately focused on the movement. It wasn't a professional thief. It was something much smaller, more fragile. On the monitor, he saw the diminutive figure sneaking between the carefully pruned rose bushes. At first, he thought it was a lost animal, but when the camera focused better, his heart skipped a beat involuntarily. It was a child. A skeletal little girl who moved with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. For an instant, something stirred inside his chest. A buried memory tried to emerge, but he pushed it back into the depths of his armored mind. Children were his weak spot, his open wound. For that very reason, he could not allow weakness. The girl had reached the kitchen. The back door was ajar to air out the room, and she slipped through it like a ghost. The smell of fresh food hit her like a wave, making her stomach rumble audibly. On the marble counter, there were freshly baked loaves of bread, colorful fruits, leftovers from a lunch that would be thrown away. Her trembling little hands reached for a piece of bread. It was small, almost insignificant to those who lived in abundance. But for her, it represented the difference between living another day and succumbing to hunger. When her fingers touched the soft surface, she closed her eyes for a second, silently, thanking some higher power. It was at that moment that the camera captured her face with perfect clarity. The millionaire, who was watching everything from his office, felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Not by the small and famished features of the child, but by something she carried on her chest, a small golden brooch that shone against the rags of her clothing. His hands trembled imperceptibly. That brooch, it wasn't possible. He knew every detail of that piece, every delicate curve of the flower-shaped design. It had been his. It had belonged to the only woman he had ever truly loved. The main alarm went off when the girl accidentally knocked over a glass. The sound echoed through the mansion like a gunshot, and in seconds, the security guards were running towards the kitchen. She didn't even have time to run. When the men in black suits surrounded her, she just curled up on the floor, protecting the piece of bread against her chest as if it were a treasure. From his office high above, the millionaire watched the scene. With his heart pounding. The girl didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't cry. She just made herself smaller, as if she wanted to disappear. And that brooch was still there, shining like a silent accusation against everything he had become. The security guards brought the girl to the main hall of the mansion, their huge hands contrasting with the fragility of the child they carried. She didn't resist, but she didn't cooperate either. She simply existed in that moment, as if she had learned that fighting was useless. The millionaire descended the stairs with measured steps, his expression a mask of ice. The servants instinctively stepped back, recognizing the signs of an impending storm. He stopped a few feet from the girl, studying her with the same coldness with which he analyzed financial reports. "What do we have here?" His voice cut through the silence like a knife. "A little thief trespassing on my property." The girl looked up for the first time, and the impact was devastating. They were eyes too big for that thin face, eyes that carried an ancient sadness and a resignation that no child should know. For a second, something wavered in his expression, but only for a second. "Sir," said one of the security guards, embarrassed, "she's just a child. She was trying to get food. Maybe we should what?" The millionaire's voice rose an octave, laden with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Teach her that trespassing has no consequences, that stealing is acceptable if you're small and pathetic." The girl remained silent, but her little hands still protected the piece of bread as if it were the most precious thing in the world. That simple gesture triggered something violent inside him, a mixture of anger, pain, and a vulnerability he couldn't bear to feel. "If you want to live like an animal," he said, his voice low and venomous, "you will be treated like one." The servants exchanged horrified glances, but no one dared to contradict him. They knew his temper. They knew that questioning him in moments like these could cost them their jobs. Only one person moved discreetly: the cleaning lady, a middle-aged woman whose eyes filled with suppressed tears. "Take her to the storage room in the back," he ordered. "There's an old cage there. It was used for the hunting dogs of the previous owner. I think it will serve perfectly." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the security guards hesitated, but their boss's icy stare left no room for discussion. Reluctantly, they guided the girl towards the back of the property. The cage was a wrought iron structure large enough for a large dog, but too small to offer dignity to a human being. It was covered in rust and cobwebs, abandoned for years in the corner of a dusty storage room. When they closed the metal door, the girl finally reacted, not with screams or pleas, but with a tremor that ran through her thin little body. She curled up in the farthest corner of the cage, hugging her knees to her chest, and for the first time in a long time, a solitary tear ran down her dirty face. The millionaire watched everything through the security cameras. His finger paused on the button that could stop this madness. But every time he looked at the brooch on the girl's chest, an old pain exploded in his chest, and he convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. Discipline, consequences, order, lies. He told himself to avoid admitting that he was punishing an innocent child for the ghosts of his own past. That night, while the entire mansion slept a restless sleep, only one person remained awake. The cleaning lady, whose name was as irrelevant to her employers as her humanity, lay in bed with a broken heart. She had raised 5 children alone. She knew hunger. She knew despair. And in that cage was a child who could be any one of her grandchildren. The injustice burned in her chest like acid, but she knew that confronting the boss directly would be useless. Instead, she began to plot a silent plan of resistance. The early morning brought with it a biting cold that penetrated through the bars of the rusty cage. The girl had managed to sleep only a few hours, waking up at every noise with the sharpened instinct of someone who had learned that danger never slept. Her little body was curled up in a position that allowed for maximum body heat, but still, she shivered. The cleaning lady woke up before dawn, as was her custom for decades. But that morning, her routine had a different purpose. While preparing her simple coffee in the basement kitchen, reserved for the staff, she discreetly separated a few items: a small apple, a piece of bread, a plastic cup, and a bottle of water. She knew every corner of that mansion, every schedule of the security systems, every movement pattern of the other employees. For 40 years, working for wealthy families, she had learned to be invisible, a skill that had now become her secret weapon. At 5:30 in the morning, when the security guards made their shift change, and there was a 3-minute window, without direct surveillance in the storage room, she sneaked through the service corridors. Her footsteps were as silent as those of a ghost, her movements calculated with surgical precision. The girl was awake when she arrived, her large eyes fixed on the figure approaching in the dim light, and instinctively she curled up even more in the corner of the cage. She had learned that adults usually brought pain or disappointment. "Shh," the cleaning lady whispered, kneeling next to the bars. "Don't be afraid. I brought something for you." The voice was soft, filled with a maternal tenderness that the girl hadn't heard in so long that she had almost forgotten what it sounded like. Slowly, she raised her face, her eyes meeting those of the older woman. "You must be hungry," continued the cleaning lady, extending the piece of bread through the bars. "Eat slowly, little one. Your stomach needs to get used to it again." The girl's trembling little hands reached out hesitantly, as if this were a mirage that could disappear at any moment. When her fingers touched the warm bread, she brought it close to her face and inhaled deeply. It was real. It was real food. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. They were the first words she had spoken since arriving at the mansion. The cleaning lady's heart broke upon hearing that fragile little voice. "What's your name, dear?" The girl hesitated, as if she wasn't sure if she still possessed a name. I don't know if it matters anymore." "Of course it matters," the woman replied firmly. "Everyone has a name. Everyone matters." As the girl ate small pieces of bread, chewing slowly as instructed, the cleaning lady observed her delicate features. There was something familiar about that face, something she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the universality of childhood suffering, but there was a strange sense of déjà vu. "Why are you helping me?" the girl asked, interrupting her. "Thoughts." The question was simple, but it carried the weight of someone who had learned to distrust kindness. The cleaning lady felt tears prick her eyes. "Because it's the right thing to do," she replied. "When we see someone needing help, we help, especially when that person is a child." "Does the man who put me here, does he hate me?" The question hit the cleaning lady like a punch to the gut. How to explain to a 7-year-old the complexities of human pain? How to justify the cruelty of an adult without minimizing her suffering? "I think," she said carefully, "that he is suffering a lot. Sometimes when people suffer too much, they can't see the pain of others. That doesn't make what he did right, but maybe it explains it a little." The girl nodded, as if that made some sense in her already troubled world. "My mom also suffered a lot," she said softly, "before she went away forever." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of the mansion waking up. The cleaning lady knew she needed to leave before someone noticed her absence, but something held her there, close to that child who carried burdens too heavy for her age. "I'll be back," she promised, gently touching the small fingers through the bars. "Every time I can, I'll bring food and water. You're not alone, understand?" The girl nodded, and for the first time since arriving at the mansion, a small smile touched her lips. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a ray of hope in the darkness. For 3 days, the routine established itself as a clandestine dance between compassion and cruelty. The cleaning lady continued her secret visits, bringing small portions of food and words of comfort that seemed to nourish not only the girl's body, but also her wounded soul. The millionaire, in turn, had become a prisoner of his own surveillance. The security cameras that had once been installed to protect his privacy had now become windows into an obsession he couldn't understand. Dozens of times a day, he found himself alternating between the screens that showed the storage room. On the first morning, when he saw the cleaning lady approaching the cage, his first impulse was to intercept her. His hand flew to the intercom, ready to order the security guards to detain her, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the gentleness with which the woman moved, or the way the girl reacted to her presence, not with fear, but with a timid hope that he hadn't seen in a long time. He watched, mesmerized, as the cleaning lady fed the child through the bars. There was a tenderness in that gesture that awakened memories he had buried deep within. Memories of a time when he himself had been capable of kindness, before life had taught him that love was an open wound waiting to bleed. On the second day, he noticed subtle changes in the girl. She no longer curled up in the corner of the cage like a wounded animal. Instead, she sat near the bars, as if awaiting the cleaning lady's visits. There was color in her pale cheeks, and her eyes no longer carried that desperate resignation. It was on the third day that he finally managed to see the brooch clearly enough to be sure. When the girl moved to receive the water that the cleaning lady offered her, the golden piece caught the morning light in a way that left no doubt. It was his ex-wife's brooch. Not a similar piece. It was exactly the same jewel she wore the day they met, the day they got married, the day they lost everything. His hands trembled as he opened the locked drawer of his desk. Inside it, kept as relics of a past that insisted on haunting him, were some photographs that he couldn't discard nor bear to look at. In the first one, his ex-wife smiled at the camera, wearing exactly the same brooch that now adorned the chest of a starving girl. How was it possible? She had taken all her jewelry when they divorced, claiming she needed something to start her life over. He never knew what had happened to those pieces, and frankly, he didn't care. But now, seeing that specific brooch on the chest of an abandoned child, 1,000 questions exploded in his mind. That afternoon, he made a decision that surprised him. Instead of calling one of his many contacts to investigate the girl's origin, he himself went down to the storage room, not to confront her or free her, but simply to see her up close, without the mediation of the security cameras. She was sleeping when he arrived, curled up on some rags that the cleaning lady had managed to smuggle into the cage. Even in her sleep, she protected the piece of bread she had saved from the last meal, as if someone could steal it during the night. He approached silently, studying her delicate features. There was something disturbingly familiar about that face, besides the brooch, the line of the eyebrow, perhaps, the shape of the chin. Characteristics that could be coincidence, but that awakened uncomfortable echoes in his memory. The girl woke up suddenly, as if she sensed his presence. Her eyes widened as she saw him so close, and instinctively she moved to the back of the cage. But there was no fear in her gaze. There was curiosity, and something else, something that seemed almost recognition. "You're not afraid of me," he said, more an observation than a question. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "I've been afraid of worse things." The answer hit him like a punch, not by her words, but by the way she said them, with a dignity that didn't suit her age or situation. It was as if that child carried an ancient wisdom, forged in suffering. "Where did you get that?" he asked, pointing to the brooch. She looked down, touching the piece with reverence. "It was my mother's. It's the only thing left of her." "And who was your mother?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but the girl was not intimidated. Instead, she approached the bars, as if she wanted to study him better. "She told me that my father was a very sad man," she replied. "That he had lost someone very important and couldn't love anyone anymore. She said that's why he never came to meet me." The world seemed to stop around him. The girl's words echoed in his mind like funeral bells, carrying implications he wasn't prepared to face. The millionaire left the storage room reeling, like a man who had just discovered that everything he believed in was a lie. The girl's words echoed in his mind with the persistence of a siren, impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Back in his office, he locked the door and, with trembling hands, picked up the phone. There was a private investigator who had worked for him before on sensitive matters involving his business. He never imagined he would one day hire him to investigate his own life. "I need you to find out everything about a child," he said, when the man answered. "I want to know who her parents are, where she was born, how she ended up on the streets, everything. And I need this information by tomorrow." "Sir, these types of investigations usually take at least a week." "You don't understand." His voice cut off any protest. "Pay whatever it takes, use whatever resources you need, but I want that information tomorrow. It's a matter of life and death." And in a way, it was exactly that. The life he had built on the ruins of his past was crumbling with every second that passed. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the hallways of the mansion like a ghost, stopping inevitably in front of the windows that overlooked the storage room. Even in the darkness, he knew she was there, in that cage that now seemed not only cruel but monstrous. The memories he had buried began to emerge against his will. He remembered the last months of his marriage, when his ex-wife had become distant and melancholic. He had attributed her behavior to grief over the daughter they had lost, never imagining there could be another reason. He remembered the way she looked at him in the last days before the divorce, not with anger or resentment, but with a deep sadness, as if she was saying goodbye to something much more than a failed marriage. And he remembered how she had insisted on taking only her personal jewelry, saying she needed something to start a new life. The next morning, the investigator arrived earlier than promised. He was pale and clearly disturbed, carrying a brown file that seemed to weigh much more than it should. "Sir," he said, hesitating at the office door, I think it would be best if you sat down before you see this." The millionaire didn't sit down. Instead, he snatched the file from the man's hands and opened it on the desk. What he saw inside made his legs buckle. The girl's birth certificate showed that she had been born exactly 10 months after his divorce. The mother's name was too familiar to be a coincidence. It was his ex-wife. The father's name was blank, but there was a handwritten note in the margin. Father unknown, child not acknowledged. But it was the photograph that destroyed him completely. It was an image from his ex-wife's driver's license, taken a few months before her death. She was visibly ill, her hair covered by a scarf and her face too thin. But her eyes carried the same expression he had seen on the face of the girl in the cage. "There's more," the investigator said reluctantly. "We found medical records. Your ex-wife discovered she was pregnant 2 weeks after the divorce. She tried to contact you several times in the early months, but I told my assistant to block all her calls," he finished, his voice just a strangled whisper. "She had complications during the pregnancy. She developed a severe autoimmune disease that worsened after childbirth. She lived only long enough to care for the girl during the first few years, but she didn't have the resources for proper treatment. When she died, the child stayed with her new partner, but he abandoned her on the streets a few weeks later." The world crumbled around him. The girl in the cage wasn't just an abandoned child who had broken into his house. She was his daughter, his own daughter, whom he had locked up like an animal for trying to steal a piece of bread. All the times, he had watched her through the cameras, trying to understand why she disturbed him so much. All the moments he had felt a strange connection, a familiarity he couldn't explain. Now everything made sense in the most devastating way possible. He had lost a daughter in a tragic accident years ago, and now he discovered that he had gained another, only to treat her with a cruelty he could never forgive himself for. Without saying a word to the investigator, he ran through the hallways of the mansion towards the storage room. His footsteps echoed like funeral drums, each one carrying the weight of a guilt that threatened to destroy him completely. When he reached the cage, she was awake, sitting near the bars as if she were expecting him. There was something different in her eyes, not surprise at seeing him, but a kind of peaceful recognition, as if she knew this moment would eventually come. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked, with a voice too soft for a 7-year-old. He fell to his knees in front of the cage, his hands trembling as he searched for the keys. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice broken by a pain that seemed to tear his soul. "My God, I'm so sorry." The keys jangled in his trembling hands, but he couldn't find the lock through the tears that were finally flowing after years of emotional drought. The girl watched in silence, her large eyes filled with an understanding that transcended her age. "You're my father," she said, not as a question, but as a simple and devastating realization. "I am," he admitted, finally managing to open the cage. "And I'm the worst father that ever existed. I didn't know. I never knew you existed. If I had known—" "Mom said you wouldn't know how to love me," the girl replied, slowly coming out of the cage. "She said you were too broken inside." The words hit him like knives. Each syllable carried the naked truth of his failures as a man, as a husband, as a father. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he had become unable to see the suffering around him. She was right, he admitted, extending his hands hesitantly towards his daughter. But I want to learn. If you let me, if you can forgive me, I want to learn to be your father. The revelation of paternity should have been the end of the story, the moment when father and daughter reunited and began to heal their wounds together. But the outside world rarely allows human stories to follow such simple scripts, and reality was about to intrude in a brutal way. 3 days after the girl's release from the cage, while the millionaire was still trying to process the magnitude of his discovery and build a bridge with the daughter he had unknowingly rejected, a news crew appeared at the gates of his mansion. The cleaning lady, the same woman who had risked her job to feed a starving child, had been approached by an investigative journalist on her way home. Initially, she had refused to speak, but when the reporter mentioned that there were rumors about a child being held captive by one of the wealthiest men in the city, her conscience wouldn't allow her to remain silent. "I can't pretend I didn't see it anymore," she had said, her words trembling with emotion. "That child was locked in a cage like an animal. She was starving, and no one did anything. I tried to help, but it wasn't enough. Someone needs to speak for the child who has no voice." What the cleaning lady didn't know was that her attempt to protect the girl was about to unleash a media storm that would threaten to destroy any chance of reconciliation between father and daughter. The first story aired on the morning news, with grainy images obtained by drones flying over the property. The headline was sensational and devastating. "Millionaire holds child captive. 7-year-old girl found locked in iron cage." Millionaire watched the news with growing horror, his daughter sitting beside him on the living room sofa. He had spent the last 3 days trying to create a safe environment for her, turning one of the guest rooms into a small children's paradise, hiring doctors to care for her malnutrition, and therapists specializing in childhood trauma. But now, all of that seemed insignificant in the face of the public fury that was being unleashed. "Why are they saying these things?" the girl asked, her little voice filled with confusion. "You're not mean to me anymore." The innocence of the question broke his heart. How to explain to a 7-year-old the complexities of media justice? How to make her understand that the outside world didn't know the whole story, that all they saw was the image of a rich man abusing a vulnerable child? "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people make judgments before they know all the facts. They're trying to protect you, but they don't know that we're trying to be a family now." "Are they going to separate us?" The question came out in a frightened whisper. Before he could answer, the house intercom buzzed. It was his lawyers, arriving in a caravan for an emergency meeting. But along with them, like predatory shadows, came the press cars, the television broadcast vans, the photographers, with their powerful lenses capable of capturing every expression of pain through the windows of the mansion. "Sir," said his lead attorney, a grey-haired man whose grave expression left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation, "we need to discuss damage control strategies. The district attorney's office is already under pressure to open an investigation. There are demands for pre-trial detention being filed. The situation is getting out of control." "Damage control strategies," he repeated, his voice filled with bitter disbelief. "This is my daughter. My own daughter who I just discovered existed." "Sir, with all due respect," another attorney interjected, "that doesn't matter to public opinion. What they see is a powerful man abusing a vulnerable child. The fact that she's your daughter might even make the situation worse. It could be interpreted as parental neglect." It was then that the doorbell rang insistently. It wasn't more lawyers or journalists. It was Child Protective Services, accompanied by social workers and 2 police officers. Every parent's worst nightmare was materializing before his eyes. "Sir," said the head social worker, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, "we're here to assess the child's conditions and determine if this is a safe environment for her. We have a court order that allows us to remove the child immediately, if we deem it necessary." The girl, who'd been playing silently with new dolls in a corner of the room, looked up at the woman's words. Her eyes widened with a terror he recognized. It was the same expression she had when she was in the cage, the expression of someone who was about to be separated from everything she knew once again. "No," she said, running to him and grabbing his hand with surprising strength. "Please don't take me away from him. He's my father now. He apologized to me." The scene was simultaneously touching and devastating. Here was a child who had been abandoned by the world, defending the man who had mistreated her simply because he was the only family connection she had. It was a testament to the human need to belong to someone, even when that someone had caused pain. "Honey," the social worker said, her voice softening slightly, "we know this might be confusing, but we're here to protect you. We're going to take you to a safe place where—" "I want to stay with my dad," the girl interrupted, her words coming out with a determination that surprised everyone in the room. "I know he did bad things, but he didn't know who I was. Now he knows, and he's good to me." The millionaire felt the tears welling up in his eyes again. His daughter, this small and brave child who had survived unimaginable abandonment, was fighting to protect the fragile relationship they had begun to build, and he was about to lose her because of his own mistakes. "Please," he said, addressing the social worker directly. "I know I've made terrible mistakes. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but she's my daughter, and I just found that out. Let me prove that I can be the father she deserves." "Sir," the social worker replied, "we know about the paternity revelation, but that doesn't erase the fact that the child was kept in inhumane conditions. Our priority is her well-being, not your family reconciliation." It was at that moment that an unexpected voice was heard. The cleaning lady had arrived, still wearing her work uniform, but with a determined expression that no one had seen before. "I need to speak," she said, stepping forward into the center of the room. "I was the one who told the press about the girl in the cage, and I don't regret it. But now you need to hear the rest of the story." The silence that followed the cleaning lady's words was as taut as a violin string about to snap. All eyes turned to the middle-aged woman who had spent decades being invisible in that house, but who now stood at the center of a storm that could define a child's fate. "My name is Rosa," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "For 40 years I've worked for wealthy families, and I've learned to keep my mouth shut and do my job. But 3 weeks ago, when I saw a child being locked in a cage like an animal, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." The social worker nodded, encouragingly, clearly expecting a testimony that would confirm her worst suspicions about the millionaire. "But Rosa wasn't finished. I told you about the cage because it was the right thing to do," she continued, "but you need to know what happened after. You need to know about the nights I spent awake, taking food secretly to that girl. You need to know about the tears I saw him shed when he found out who she really was." The millionaire looked at Rosa with surprise. He didn't know that she had witnessed his moments of emotional breakdown, the instance when the mask of coldness had crumbled completely. "For 3 days, Rosa went on, I saw a man who thought he was protecting his pain turn into every father's worst nightmare. When he found out that girl was his daughter, I saw something I never thought I'd see in 40 years working in this house. I saw him break completely." "That doesn't justify—" the social worker began, but Rosa raised her hand. "Let me finish." She said with an authority that surprised everyone, "You want to protect this child? Then look at her, really look at her. Do you see a terrified girl, begging not to be separated from the man who mistreated her? No, you see a girl who has finally found someone who belongs to her." Rosa approached the girl, who was still holding tightly to her newfound father's hand. "Honey," she said softly, "tell these people how you feel now." The girl looked around the room, her large eyes studying each adult face that awaited her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "I lived on the streets for a long time," she said. "I know what it's like when someone is really mean. My dad did a bad thing to me, but he didn't know who I was. When he found out, he cried. Mean people don't cry when they hurt other people. They laugh." The child's words hit the room like a lightning bolt. There was a naked truth in her observation that cut through all the legal and bureaucratic complexities that the adults had created. "Around the situation, he gave me a pretty room," she continued, "and new dolls, and he reads me stories before I go to sleep. He's still sad sometimes, but he's not mean anymore." The social worker exchanged glances with her colleagues, clearly struggling with the emotional complexity of the situation. There were protocols to follow, procedures established for cases of child abuse, but there was also a real child with real feelings, asking not to be separated from the only family she had ever known. "There's something else," Rosa said, feeling. She needed to seal her argument. "Do you know how many abandoned children I've seen over the years? How many sad stories have passed through this house, through news reports on television or charity requests that came in the mail? This man never showed interest in any of them, but this girl, she's different, not just because she's his daughter, but because she awakened something in him that I thought had died a long time ago." "And what would that be?" asked one of the police officers, who had remained silent until then. "Hope," Rosa replied simply. "For the first time in years, I see hope in his eyes. And it's not just hope for him, it's hope for her too. Do you think you're going to find a better family for this girl than with her own father, who now knows she exists and is desperate to make up for his mistakes?" The millionaire felt his throat tighten with emotion. Rosa had seen things that he didn't even know were visible. She had witnessed his transformation from a perspective that not even he himself possessed. "Sir," the social worker said, turning to him, "we understand that the situation is complex, but our primary responsibility is to the child's well-being. If we allow her to remain here, we will need guarantees, regular counseling, supervised visits, periodic medical reports. Anything," he replied immediately. "Any conditions you impose. I just can't lose her again. I already lost one daughter. I couldn't survive losing another." It was then that the girl let go of his hand and approached the social worker. Everyone in the room held their breath, fearing that she was about to change her mind. "Ma'am," she said, her little voice clear and determined, "I know you want to help me, but I don't need to be saved from him. He's the one who needs to be saved from himself, and I want to help him do that." The simplicity and depth of the statement left everyone speechless. A 7-year-old had just articulated something that none of the adults present had been able to express, that sometimes saving someone means allowing them to be saved by another. "Very well," the social worker said finally. "We will establish a 6-month evaluation period. There will be regular visits, mandatory counseling for both of you, and any sign that the child's well-being is being compromised will result in immediate removal." "Thank you," the millionaire whispered, pulling his daughter into a hug that carried all the relief and gratitude he could express. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right." But as the official representatives prepared to leave, the noise outside only increased. The press had multiplied, and now there were hundreds of people at the gates, some supporters, others detractors, all with fervent opinions about a situation they barely understood. The real battle was just beginning. In the days following the visit from Child Protective Services, the mansion became a besieged fortress. The gates were surrounded by a crowd that grew with each passing hour. Journalists, child rights activists, onlookers drawn by human tragedy transformed into spectacle. Television station helicopters hovered over the property constantly, their cameras trying to capture any image that could feed the public's insatiable hunger for drama. Inside the house, father and daughter tried to build a routine amidst the chaos. She had adapted with surprising ease to her new life, perhaps because anything was better than the streets, or perhaps because children possess a capacity for forgiveness that adults secretly envy. He, on the other hand, struggled with demons that went far beyond the external pressure. "Daddy," she said during breakfast on a Tuesday, using for the first time the word he thought he would never hear again, "why do you keep looking out the window with that sad face?" He turned from the office window, where he watched the crowd outside with a mixture of resentment and fear. "I'm worried about you," he admitted, "about what all this fuss might be doing to you." "You mean the people shouting?" she asked, biting into a piece of toast. "I've seen people shouting before. On the street, they're always shouting. At least now they're not shouting at me." The naturalness with which she spoke about her past still surprised him. There was a resilience in her, forged by experiences, that no child should have, but there was also an innocence that had somehow survived it all. "Some of those people want to separate us," he said carefully. "They think it would be better for you to live with another family." She stopped chewing and looked at him with those big eyes that seemed to see through his soul. "And do you think it would be?" The question hit him like a punch in the gut. For weeks, he had been questioning exactly that. Would it really be better for her to be with someone who didn't carry the weight of having mistreated her? Someone who could offer her a clean love without the stain of guilt and regret? "I don't know," he admitted, his brutal honesty cutting through the morning air. "I want to believe that I can be a good father to you. But I've never been good at loving people. Whenever I've tried, I've ended up hurting or losing the ones I loved." She put her toast on the plate and approached him. At 7 years old, she was too small to reach his face, but big enough to put her little hands on his knees and force him to bend down to look her in the eyes. "Mom told me something before she died," she said, her voice laden with a seriousness that contrasted with her age. "She said that some people get broken inside when bad things happen to them, but she said that broken people aren't bad people. They just need someone to help them glue the pieces back together." The tears he had learned to contain in public welled up without warning. "What if I can't fix myself? What if I end up hurting you again?" "Then I'll help you try again," she replied, with the devastating simplicity that only children possess. "Because that's what families do." It was at that moment that Rosa entered the room, carrying a tray with tea and cookies, but her expression was tense, and she looked significantly at the millionaire before speaking. "Sir, there's someone here who needs to speak with you. Said it's urgent." "If it's the press—" "It's not the press," Rosa interrupted. "It's someone from your past, someone who says they know the truth about the girl's mother." His blood ran cold. Who could it be? What truths from the past were about to emerge to further complicate an already impossible situation? The visitor was waiting in the parlor, a middle-aged man, well-dressed, with a face that carried the grave expression of someone who brings difficult news. When the millionaire entered the room, the man stood up and extended his hand. "I'm Dr. Ricardo Mendez," he said. "I was your ex-wife's doctor during her pregnancy and the last years of her life. What do you want?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but the doctor's presence awakened fears he didn't know he still carried. "I came because I can't live with what I know anymore," Dr. Mendez replied. "Your ex-wife made me promise that I would never tell the truth, but seeing what's happening now, Seeing that child being used as a pawn in a game of public opinion, I can't stay silent anymore. What truth? But even asking the question, he already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. She tried to contact you dozens of times when she found out she was pregnant, Dr. Mendez said. Called your company, sent letters, even went to your office in person. But your instructions were clear. No contact with her would be allowed. The room seemed to spin around him. I didn't know. I thought she was just trying to... After the divorce, I thought any contact would just be to hurt me more. She was desperate, the doctor continued. The pregnancy was complicated. She needed expensive medical care that she couldn't afford. More importantly, she wanted you to know that you were going to be a father again. Why are you telling me this now? The question came out as a lament, because there's something else, something she made me swear I would never reveal, but that you both need to know. Dr. Mendez hesitated, as if the next words were physically painful to pronounce. The illness she developed, it wasn't just a complication of the pregnancy. It was caused by the stress, by the anguish of being abandoned when she most needed support. In medical terms, she died of a broken heart. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The millionaire sat down heavily in the armchair, the weight of guilt threatening to crush him completely. But, Dr. Mendez continued, she didn't die angry. In her last days, she made me promise one thing. If you ever found out about the girl, I should tell you that she forgave you, that she understood your pain, and that she didn't want that pain to be passed on to the child. She forgave me. Her last words were about you and about the girl. She said she hoped that one day you two could heal each other. It was at that moment that the girl appeared in the doorway of the room. She had overheard part of the conversation, enough to understand that they were talking about her mother. Without saying a word, she approached her father and placed a small hand on his shoulder. "Mom's watching now," she said softly. "And she's happy because we're not alone anymore." The doctor looked at the scene with tears in his eyes. "She has her eyes," he said, "but she has your determination. Maybe that's exactly what you both need." Outside, the crowd continued to grow. The helicopters continued to hover, and the world continued to judge a situation it barely understood. But inside the parlor of a besieged mansion, a broken man and a brave girl began to understand that sometimes redemption comes not through the forgiveness of others, but through the mutual forgiveness of two people who found each other at the moment they needed each other most. 3 months after the media storm that almost destroyed any chance of reconciliation, the mansion had become a completely different place. The crowds at the gates had dispersed, chasing new scandals to feed their insatiable appetite for human drama. The press helicopters had found other tragedies to exploit. But within those walls of marble and glass, a silent and profound transformation was taking place. The millionaire had religiously complied with all the requirements of child protective services. The family therapy sessions took place twice a week. The medical reports were delivered punctually, and the supervisory visits were received with total cooperation. But more important than the fulfillment of legal obligations was the change that was occurring in the hearts of both. The girl had gained weight. Her eyes no longer carried that ancient sadness, and her smiles, once rare and hesitant, now illuminated the hallways of the house with a frequency that surprised even Rosa. She had started attending a private school nearby, where she quickly stood out not only for her sharp intelligence, but for the emotional maturity that impacted teachers and classmates alike. "Daddy," she said on a Sunday afternoon, while they were playing in the garden that had once been just an impeccable decoration and now had a special area with swings and a treehouse, "do you remember what I was like before?" He stopped pushing. The swing where she was sitting. It was a question that haunted him constantly. How did she process the trauma of having been mistreated by him? How did she reconcile that terrible experience with the love they now shared? "I remember," he said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because I almost don't remember anymore," she replied, swinging her legs that now reached the ground without difficulty, a sign of how much she had grown in recent months. "I remember that it hurt and that I was afraid, but when I look at you now, it's like you're a different person." "Maybe I am," he admitted. "You've transformed me into someone I didn't know I could be." "Aunt Rosa said that broken people can be fixed if someone loves them enough," she said, using the affectionate title she had adopted for the cleaning lady who had become part of the family in an official capacity. "Do you think we're both fixed now?" The question touched a wound that was still healing, but that no longer hurt with the devastating intensity of before. "I think we're learning to fix ourselves," he replied. "Every day, a little bit." It was at that moment that Rosa appeared on the garden door, carrying a tray with iced lemonade and homemade cookies. But there was something different in her expression, a kind of deep satisfaction that went beyond the simple joy of seeing the family reunited. "Sir," she said, placing the tray on the garden table, "some mail arrived that I think you'll want to see." It was an official envelope with the letterhead of Child Protective Services. For a moment, his heart stopped. Would there be new demands? Had some problem arisen during the evaluations? With slightly trembling hands, he opened the envelope and read the contents. His eyes widened, and he needed to read it twice to make sure he had understood correctly. "What is it, Daddy?" the girl asked, noticing his expression. It's the final evaluation report," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "They're closing the supervision. They say that we're a stable and functional family." The girl got off the swing and ran to him, hugging him with a strength that still surprised him. She was small, but her love seemed to have the power to heal wounds that he thought would never heal. "Does that mean that no one can separate us anymore?" she asked. "It means that we're officially a family," he replied, picking her up in his arms. "Forever." Rosa approached, wiping the tears that were running freely down her face. "I always knew it would work out," she said. "Since that first night, when I saw you crying in the hallways, I knew that girl had awakened something good in you." In the months that followed, the transformation extended beyond the walls of the mansion. The millionaire, inspired by the second chance that life had given him, made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He established a foundation dedicated to children in vulnerable situations, specializing in cases of abandonment and family neglect. "It's not charity," he explained to the foundation's board of directors during the first meeting. "It's a debt I owe to every child who, like my daughter, was left to fend for themselves by adults who should have protected them." The foundation was not just another charity administered from a distance. He was present, involved in every case, every story. His daughter, despite her young age, often accompanied him on visits to shelters and foster care centers. There was something powerful in seeing that girl, who had survived abandonment, offering words of encouragement to other children in similar situations. "You know what's cool about being adopted?" she said to a group of children in one of the shelters visited by the foundation. "It's finding out that you always had a family, you just didn't know where they were." The child's simple words touched hearts that the elaborate speeches of adults could not reach. She had become, without knowing it, an ambassador of hope for children who had lost faith in love. Rosa, who now held an official position as care coordinator for the foundation, often watched father and daughter working together with a smile that carried the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a miracle. "Who would have thought," she murmured to herself, "that such a terrible tragedy could generate so much good?" A year after the day the girl had tried to steal a piece of bread, they organized a special ceremony at the mansion. It wasn't a public or media event. It was an intimate celebration to mark not only the anniversary of when they met, but also the official legal adoption of the girl. The judge who presided over the ceremony was the same one who had initially considered removing the child from the house. Now, watching the family united, he couldn't hide his admiration for the transformation he had witnessed. "I rarely see cases where redemption is so complete," he said, signing the papers that formalized what had long been an emotional reality. "You've both proven that sometimes the most unlikely endings are also the truest." During the small party that followed, the girl approached her father with a carefully wrapped gift. It was something small, clearly made by her. "What's this?" he asked, intrigued. "Open it," she said, almost vibrating with anticipation. Inside the colorful paper was the golden brooch, the same one that had belonged to his ex-wife, that had been the first clue to the connection between them. But now it was different. The girl had added small, colorful rhinestones around the original flower, transforming it into something new, but retaining the essence of the original. "I asked Aunt Rosa to teach me how to do this," she explained. "I wanted it to be ours now. Not just Mom's, not just mine. Ours." He held the brooch with reverence, understanding the depth of the gesture. That small jewel had been a symbol of loss, then an instrument of revelation, and now it was transformed into a symbol of renewal and unity. "It's perfect," he said, his voice choked up. "Just like you." "Just like us," she corrected, hugging him, with that surprising strength that had become her trademark. As night fell over the mansion, now truly transformed into a home, the three, father, daughter, and Rosa, who had officially become part of the family, sat in the garden to watch the stars. The girl was nestled between her father and the woman who had become her second mother, counting the constellations she had learned at school. "Daddy," she said, pointing to a particularly bright star, "do you think Mom can see us from up there?" "I'm sure she can," he replied, pulling her closer, "and I think she's very proud of how you've become so brave and kind, despite everything you've been through. And proud of you too," she added, "for having learned to love again." Rosa, observing the scene with tears of joy in her eyes, murmured a silent prayer of gratitude. She had witnessed many sad stories throughout her life, but few as beautiful as this one, the story of how a starving girl and a heartbroken man had saved each other. Later that night, after the girl had fallen asleep in her room, which she had insisted on decorating with photos of all the children helped by the foundation, the millionaire stood for a few minutes at the door, watching her sleep. It was no longer the restless sleep of someone who feared the dawn, but the peaceful rest of someone who knew she would be loved the next day. He thought about the impossible journey that had brought them there, from the cruelty of that first meeting to the complete redemption they now experienced. He thought about his ex-wife, and for the first time in years, he was able to remember her without pain, only with gratitude for the gift she had given him, even when he didn't know he was receiving it. "Thank you," he whispered to the universe. To her, to the mysterious force that had transformed his cruel punishment into his greatest blessing. The girl stirred slightly in her sleep, and he heard an almost inaudible whisper, "I love you, Daddy." Words he thought he would never hear again, words that healed wounds he thought would be eternal, words that transformed a broken man into a father and a punishment into a miracle. Outside, the world continued to spin, with its tragedies and joys, its injustices, and its moments of grace. But inside that house, an unlikely family had discovered that sometimes the most painful encounters can lead to the deepest connections, and that true love is not the one that never faces trials, but the one that finds strength to start over. After almost losing everything, the story of the girl who tried to steal a piece of bread and ended up stealing a millionaire's heart had become something bigger than either of them had imagined possible. It had become proof that redemption exists, that forgiveness heals, and that sometimes we need to be broken completely to discover how to rebuild ourselves in a more beautiful and true way. And that night, under the starry sky that had witnessed so much suffering and joy, a brave girl and her repentant father slept the peaceful sleep of those who had finally found their place in the world, not despite their scars, but because of how they had chosen to heal them together. What would you do if you found out that the child you just punished is actually your own daughter? Comment below and share this story with someone special. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive stories that transform lives every day.